One of the primary goals of the Ghost Crew in Ahsoka is not only to find and stop Thrawn and his plans, but also potentially recover the Jedi Knight, Ezra Bridger. The build-up to them ultimately finding Ezra and bringing him back is one of the biggest backbones of the current story arc. We have seen how the Ghost Crew has improved their skill and power since the last time we've seen them, but this brings up a very interesting question. Where exactly will Ezra's power level be when we find him? When we last left him off in Star Wars Rebels, Ezra had proven himself to be a competent Jedi, but it has been 10 years since we last saw the young Jedi Knight, assuming Thrawn hasn't kept Ezra in some sort of prolonged stasis or suspended animation. Ezra's power should be profoundly beyond where it once was. Of course, in order to figure out what this means, we would need to actually go back and scale Ezra's power for where it was when we last saw him, and then speculate the inflation of that power to where we could see him in the current story. But what's interesting about this is Ezra actually has a very high force potential, and the last time we saw him, he was extremely powerful and one of the most underrated young characters in terms of their power scaling. Ezra by the end of the Rebels series was absolutely no joke, and we'll be explaining that today. Ezra Bridger was one of those special few born innately with a very powerful and natural connection to the Force. He had been showing signs of Force sensitivity at a very early age, which manifests itself as a child seemingly able to see or know things before they happen. According to Qui-Gon Jinn, this can also manifest as having faster than average reflexes, and we know from Tales of the Jedi through young Ahsoka that it also manifests as being extraordinarily empathetic, as the child is able to sense or change emotions in people or creatures that surround them. In some especially rare cases, the child might have an innate affinity towards telekinesis or other abilities without needing training. It was this way for the young Ezra Bridger, who was able to sense the presence of Kanan Jarrus on Lothal, as well as sense that Kanan was hiding a Jedi holocron in a compartment. Without training, Ezra also saw some abilities to alter his physical skill, jumping higher than should have been possible. And animals seemed to gravitate towards Ezra and take an instinctual liking to him, a piece of information which will be very important in a moment. This all goes to say and prove that without needing any blood test, Ezra's potential in the Force was insanely naturally high, and when he actually began training in the Force, he progressed far faster than usual, even though Kanan Jarrus himself had not become a Jedi Knight or completed his training. Even Kanan was having to admit that Ezra's abilities were progressing faster than he could teach him, and within a few months, Ezra was able to grasp some concepts that usually took younglings their whole childhood to accomplish. In just the 4 years that the events of Rebels takes place, Ezra was able to progress from being completely untrained to being around the level of a Padawan ready to face the Jedi trials. This power creep rate is important for us to know for when we calculate where he should be right around the time of the Ahsoka series. But what's incredible is Ezra progressed far faster, likely because he was in wartime, being shaped by the Empire and the forces at large. What's more important though is dark side characters being impressed with Ezra. His innate strength in the Force was something that attracted a lot of powerful beings to him. Vader was astonished that Ezra had been able to unlock the secrets of the temple on Malachor, which of course was taught to him by Maul, who then actually believed in Ezra's power himself, so much so that Maul desperately tried to make Ezra his apprentice. Towards the end, Ezra had even garnered the interest of Palpatine, who likely decided to give his attention towards Ezra once he learned all the things from Vader. The only thing that usually hindered Ezra's full progression in the Force was his own fears, stubbornness, and insecurity. But now let's analyze his actual feats, beginning with telekinesis, this being the bread and butter of any Force wielder. Jedi and Sith are typically judged based on this specific merit. Early on, Ezra was able to get telekinesis down pretty quickly, and was able to instinctively use a Force push to save Zeb from Agent Kallus. It seemed to take Ezra a while to reach a full understanding of the versatility that comes with telekinesis though. So, ironically, this is the one power that we don't see Ezra use very often. However, he liked to combine his power with others in order to achieve greater feats, such as when Ezra and Kanan combined their Force pushes to throw Vader backwards and topple the AT-STs on top of him. Of course, this was when Vader was distracted, and for a more accurate feat, Ezra was able to combine his power with Ahsoka's in order to stave off Sidious's Sith fire with a Force shield in the world between worlds. But now we reach a very important part of the power scaling. Ezra has a strong affinity towards the dark side. When embracing his hatred and anger, he was able to lift heavy stone doors in the temple on Malachor. To calculate just how impressive this is, we can use the Jedi Munthur stones as a quick reference. To the Jedi, the Munthur stones were a famous set of 7 stones which were used to train Jedi in telekinesis. Each stone weighed at least 5 metric tons. Merely jostling a stone was marked as an achievement by a young Padawan, with Jedi Knights being able to lift multiple stones at once. Only 2 or 3 other Jedi Grand Masters have been able to lift 4 or more stones, one of those being Yoda. Anyway, the Sith respects strength as it is, so it would be a safe assumption that these temple doors would undoubtedly weigh as much as at least one of the Munthur stones. Ezra, with the great amount of strain and the aid of the dark side, was able to lift one of these doors at a time, putting him beyond the level of a Padawan, something that we already know. But this was only his 2nd year of official training. This is extremely impressive, as it appears as if Maul was having a little bit of a struggle lifting the doors as well. Moving on to another important measurement tool, mental sensibilities are definitely a characteristic of one's strength. This one perhaps is one of those that Ezra struggled with the most when he was first beginning. Getting to focus his mind was the most difficult part of Ezra's training, and the one that took him the longest. This was mostly a result of his impulsivity and impatience. But soon, he would not only learn to accurately sense things around him, but he would also learn how to focus his mind and use the Force when under extreme duress. This was something that was taught to him by Ahsoka Tano in the comics, who at one point relentlessly attacked Ezra until he was able to focus enough to dodge and evade a lot of her attacks. A lot of the similar training that Ahsoka experienced under Anakin Skywalker. Going on with mental attacks, it took Ezra quite a bit of time to get down the Jedi mind trick, but eventually he was using it like a pro against Imperials, able to fool stormtroopers and even an officer at one point. However, the greatest feat with this by far is that we wanted to specifically mention what happened after he began to learn from the Sith holocron. Using the knowledge of the dark side, Ezra was able to execute the Sith ability of mind domination against an Imperial ATDP pilot, forcing the pilot to fire upon his allies before committing suicide by diving off the edge of a platform. This was perhaps one of the darkest, but most powerful things that Ezra has ever done, and he was seemingly able to do it with little effort, almost instinctually. For reference, the 2 other notable users of mind domination was Lord Sidious, and in Legends, Valkorion. But the most powerful skill that Bridger has in his arsenal is his ability to connect with the natural and supernatural world, being able to connect with nature. But also, how many erroneously label it animal friendship is one of the most underrated Force abilities ever given to Jedi or the light side in general. This aspect of the Force exemplifies what light actually is, where the dark side emotions and power comes through destructive capability or the ability to dominate. The light side is life incarnate and the connection to all living things. Ezra struggled with the temptation towards the dark side for a time, but his true affinity was always with the light side, which is shown to us by how easily Ezra is able to connect with living and supernatural creatures. With Kanan, he was able to tame a whole pack of Fire Knocks, and when he dipped into the dark side, he was able to summon one massive Fire Knock and use it against vengeance on the Imperials and the Grand Inquisitor. We may need not even to talk about his connection to the Purgles though, of whom he was able to communicate with enough for them to save his life and aid him with Thrawn, the most famous occasion when the Purgles were summoned and Ezra communicated with them so effectively that he was able to cause them to attack Thrawn and pull the Chimera into hyperspace. Ezra would also form a strong connection with the Lothwolves, who had a deep and refined connection to the Force and naturally gravitated towards the young Bridger. The Lothwolves even trusted him enough that they allowed him to access the unlimited power of the world between worlds. But now that we've addressed much of his Force abilities, what of his lightsaber skills? Ezra was traditionally trained in Xi'an, though he would learn from Anakin and the Jedi holocron how to utilize Ataru, and later he would employ some of Kanan's techniques of Sarisu into his own style. Because most of Ezra's opponents were Inquisitors that eclipsed his own skill at the time, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for Ezra to properly test himself. Many times when it comes to being a duelist, Ezra seems to suffer quite a bit, though he did eventually become skilled enough to duel Kanan to a stalemate. However, when it comes to blast deflection, he is shown to be extremely skillful. He is able to keep himself and his friends safe in the middle of an all-out firefight, not to mention he can deflect the blasters from starships. Not an easy feat at all. When in the middle of combat, Ezra seems to take a more defensive style while using more acrobatic movement to gain leverage on his opponents in order to strike them down. With all of that said, although Ezra didn't get a lot of time to shine as a duelist, we believe he would have progressed a great deal as of the time of Ahsoka. So now, where was Ezra Bridger's overall power level by the end of Rebels? We would confidently place him on the cusp of being a Jedi Knight, perhaps around where Obi-Wan was in The Phantom Menace. Ezra used feats in the Force that were usually typical for experienced Jedi Knights. However, he still has a lot of tendencies and limitations that hold him back to still being at Padawan level. But again, an extremely gifted Padawan. Something that should be noted is it takes most Jedi training their entire lives until the age of about 18 before they become a Jedi Knight. And Ezra had only been training under an inexperienced master for 4 years. It is easy to say that Ezra by the end of the Rebels series has surpassed the power level of his former master, Kanan Jarrus. As to where he should be now, that will be a bit more tricky to calculate. First, we need to acknowledge that despite his accelerated improvement rate, this all happened while he was actively training under several masters and going on many missions. This gave him the ability to frequently exercise his powers. We aren't sure yet what Ezra has been doing for the past decade. For all we know, he could have been stagnated by some of these issues by being placed in a kind of stasis, or he could have spent all that time in a cell aboard the Chimera. Point being, his progression could have been stunted by a myriad of factors. But assuming he was uninhibited from being able to train by himself with the knowledge he currently possessed and refined his abilities to where they were, then we can actually use some simple math to calculate exactly where Ezra's power scaling should be. And this can all happen by again using the Munter stones. At where he was 2 years into his training, Ezra could only lift those Sith temple doors with great effort and use of the dark side. Now with a slight reduction in power by taking away the use of the dark side, but then increasing that to where he was at the end of Rebels, then by that point, Ezra should be able to decently lift one of those Sith temple doors, which relates to being able to lift one of the Munter stones. Again, those stones were 5 tons each. Now Ezra's progression will be slightly reduced over the next 10 years since he doesn't have a master to continue teaching him. But with what we know of his innate talent and power creep, we can safely say that his power would have effectively doubled by now, if not more. That means that by now, with great effort, he should be able to lift 2 of the Munter stones, which would be 10 tons. That accurately places him on the level of an experienced Jedi Knight, as it was said that only Knights would be able to lift multiple stones. That allows us to appropriately place him at the level of Cal Kestis by the end of Jedi Fallen Order. In conclusion, we can expect to see a far more powerful and experienced Ezra tearing it up like the best of them right alongside Ahsoka Tano. While Ahsoka still drastically outclasses him in power, Ezra will be a force to be reckoned with when he's put back in the game. But anyway, my friends, what do you think of this and our power scaling of Ezra Bridger? Do you agree with our calculations? And what are your thoughts on Ezra's innate power in the Force? Thank you as always so much for visiting our archives, and we hope to see you again soon. May the Force be with you.